Okay, we are now recording. Let me just open us up in a word of prayer, and then we'll get going. Father, we thank you again, as always, for the opportunity to spend time in your word, to spend time learning about your word. Father, we ask that your Holy Spirit would enable us with the mental ability, the stamina, and just the wisdom to understand your word and to be able to interpret well and to apply it into our lives. And we ask all this in Christ's name. Amen. You good? You lose a phone or?
Yeah.
That's a big deal nowadays.
I'll just put it up there real quick. Sorry.
That's all right.
Mary, you want somebody to call you?
This IO Daily?
No, that's okay. Hello. What's the difference between NASB and NASB 1995, other than the publishing date? Is there a significant?
Yeah, it's just a more current version. They do most of these translations update their translations over given periods of time. So like there's an older NIV version, so forth and so on. Most of your modern translations will every 5 or 10 years make an update.
I wonder, because even though I know about the other translations in my electronic version, they have them separate. And that's the only one that I saw that was separated like
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Yep.
In my back pocket, and apparently it came out of my pocket before I could get my car.
Ah.
No, it was in my seat. Anyway.
Okay. You can look at the handout upper right-hand corner that says Session 3, Resources in the Interpretive Spiral. It looks like this. It should be page 13. That should be, what comes next right after what we finished last week. This is Session 3, Resources and the Interpretive Spiral. And this is the kind of the last session that we'll do that I would call foundational content. After this week's session, we will start proper in observation, interpretation, application, and correlation. Those are the 4 aspects of interpretation. And we'll spend 2 weeks in observation. Those are all yours, Iodale. And we'll spend 3 weeks in interpretation, 2 weeks in application, and 1 week in correlation to make our way through. So today, what I wanted to talk through is just to kind of go over some of the resources that you can use as you're learning to, deepen your skills in the area of biblical interpretation. What are the different tools and resources that you have at your fingertips that you can use along the way? So this picture is a good illustration of some of the core types of content you'll want to use. And they're kind of in a top to bottom prioritized kind of manner, right? So top of the stack is your Bible. And we're going to talk in a moment about different translations and what that means and those kind of things. But having multiple translations to read through is first and foremost your number one most important tool or resource. Then a concordance, and we're gonna look at the definitions of each of these. But in short, a concordance is something that basically tells you where a given word is used. So you can look up a word, and it'll tell you here are the 15 verses in the New Testament that English word appears in. And there are Greek concordances and Hebrew concordances, so you can look up Greek words and Hebrew words and all these types of things. And fortunately, the software that I'm going to show you in a moment, which is free and available on the internet, makes using a concordance extremely easy. No longer do you have to have big, thick books like the ones I brought back on the shelf over there. A lexicon. A lexicon is just a fancy way of saying a foreign language dictionary. So think a Greek dictionary, a Hebrew dictionary. I don't know why they call it a lexicon, but it's just a foreign language dictionary. We'll look more at that. An exegetical dictionary. You might have heard of something like a Vine's expository dictionary or a Nelson's illustrative dictionary. They're literally dictionaries, but they're looking up like people, places, and things from a biblical context standpoint. So if you wanted to learn about Noah, you could go to a Bible dictionary and look up Noah, and it would tell you about Noah. It's not a concordance, so it's not telling you every verse that Noah's in. It's just going to tell you about Noah and the context and geographies and things like that that may be relevant to them. It's kind of like an encyclopedia more so than a dictionary, but they call them dictionaries. Other word study books, probably the most relevant word study book is a lexicon. But we're going to talk some about things like figures of speech, which are helpful when you're doing word studies. And I'll give you some resources for those. And then last, but still important, are commentaries. We talked a little bit last week about commentaries, and that a commentary should be the very, very last book you reach for. You should not go to a commentary until you have done your own work and analysis. Only then should you go to a commentary and start to ask the question, okay, now that I've done my work, and this is what I think the passage says, let me compare what I've concluded to what others have concluded. And that may help you think differently or think slightly deeper or see things that you did not see. But typically you do not want to start with a commentary because then they're going to filter and color and predispose you to a certain way of looking at the text. And we don't want to do that out of the gate. So commentaries typically come last in that process. I know historically we tend to think of commentaries as like the easy button. Well, I just go see what so-and-so says about it. And that's fine. But again, as we mentioned last week, the problem is if you open 3 different commentaries, you're probably going to get 3 at least slightly different, if not potentially completely different views on what a given passage says. And I remember for me, when I knew nothing about all this stuff, and I would look at 2 or 3 different commentaries, it would just frustrate the stew out of me that well, if these guys can't figure out what this passage means, if they can't get an agreement on what the passage means, how in the world am I supposed to know what the passage means? That was always very frustrating to me. And it's just the nature of the beast. Remember, biblical interpretation is an art and a science. Yes, there are some principles to be followed, but they have to be applied skillfully. And that's a honed skill over time. And if I am allowing my tradition, remember we talked about the systems like Reformed, Arminian, Grace, those are your big 3 systems. If I'm letting my system color or dictate or act as, glasses that I look through, then my interpretations are always going to be tainted by the system that I'm looking at it through. And as much as possible, it's difficult, but as much as possible, we want to remove our glasses, remove our traditions, set our tradition aside, and learn how to apply the principles in a way that allow the text to speak to us as they were written to the best of our ability. None of us do this flawlessly. This is why it's an art and a skill. We have to learn over time through work and effort and repetition to get, a little better and a little better at being able to spot my own presuppositions, my own biases in the passage, so that I can set that aside and pay better attention to what I think the text is actually saying to me. Nothing wrong with having a pre-existing belief, but I don't want my pre-existing belief to dictate what the passage says. I want the passage to validate or invalidate what my pre-existing belief is. That's a harder process. Okay, let's talk about Bibles for a minute. We touched on this some last week, but this is really important and not something well known or discussed. Bibles today come in many different flavors. Let's just stick with English translations, right? Because obviously there can be a translation for every language that's out there. So we're just going to talk about English translations. There are two philosophies in the world of translations. There's what's called formal equivalence or dynamic equivalence. And formal equivalence simply means a more literal or word for word type of translation. Whereas dynamic equivalence is more of a thought for thought kind of translation. So in a formal equivalence, the main goal is to remain true to the original text. And good examples of that are like the NASB, the New King James Version, the English Standard Version. Those all tend to be more formal. They tend to be more accurate, but they can cause a more difficult reading. For example, it may sound a little more wooden, a little more stale, or just a little more difficult to understand. This is the trade-off. The more literal, because Greek and English are very different languages. Whereas the English depends on word order and context heavily. Greek is what's known as a highly inflected language. Depends heavily on the masculine, feminine, gender, and word endings and the way they spell the words really dictate how the sentence should read. So it's a very different way to communicate, Greek versus English. So there is no way to just perfectly translate from Greek to English. This is why we have these two philosophies. And some translations are a little more on the formal side, and some are more on the dynamic side. And as I mentioned last week, many more modern translations are actually hybrids, where they will use a formal literal translation where it's easy to do, but where that would sound really wooden, they would switch it to a dynamic, so that try to convey the meaning, because dynamic equivalent is more thought for thought. So it's more about, let's take the main idea of the author and then use regular English to convey the same thing. So the translators, right, there's typically a committee. The translators are going to read the Greek and they're going to say, okay, here's what we think this Greek sentence means. Now, what's the best way for us to say that in an English sentence to convey the same meaning? This is a dynamic or thought for thought kind of translation. Things like the NIV, the NLT, which is the New Living Translation. And then the Message is probably your most extreme dynamic translation. It's really not even a dynamic translation. It's genuinely a paraphrase kind of thing. They tend to be easier to read, but it can open the door to more interpretation than translation, right? Because if the translation committee is trying to convey what they think the Greek sentence means, well, the moment you start talking about what does it mean, you're not translating, you're interpreting, right? So a dynamic version opens the door for the translation committee to insert an interpretation into the meaning, as opposed to merely a translation of the text. And these are two really important words. We talked about them 2 weeks ago. This notion of translation, which is a language to language thing, and then interpretation, which is a meaning thing. What does it mean? And our goal in this class is to learn about biblical interpretation, where we're trying to understand the principles and the skill sets we need to properly understand the meaning of a text, so that we can get to the principle that it conveys and we can apply that principle to our lives and have it, change who we are. So This is a really helpful diagram. This is not exhaustive by any means. There are many more translations, English translations than this diagram represents, but this is a good amount of them. And so you can see on the word for word side, and these are kind of there in a representative order in regards to the more to the left they are, the more literal they are. And the more to the right they are, the more dynamic they are, which is why you see the message way out on the far end and why you see the New American Standard Version more towards the left. I mentioned this phrase interlinear last week, and I'm going to show you what that is some later today. But an interlinear is when you have the English sentence and then below it or above it, either way, you have the Greek words and where they align. So this Greek word are these English words, and this Greek word are these English words. And this is a way of helping you see visually what English words relate to what Greek words. And you can do a reverse linear or an interlinear. One is where the Greek comes first. So you get the Greek, the way it was written in the Greek, and then the English structure underneath it. Or an interlinear, which is the English and then the Greek underneath it. You can do it either way. Typically, you only do the reverse interlinear if you know how to read Greek, because it doesn't do us any, if you don't know how to read Greek, it doesn't do you any good to have the Greek on the top, because we don't understand the word order importance and so forth. But most software nowadays have a lot of things that can help you with that, and we'll spend a little time looking at some of that. We are going to have an entire session on nothing but word study. I think it's the first or second week of interpretation, where we're gonna use software, we're gonna do some word studies, and we're gonna learn as much as we can in 45 minutes or so about, how to actually look at a Greek word and get some sense of understanding about that with the tools that are out there. Okay, quickly to go through each of these. A concordance. It's just a list of words used in the Bible and gives references to the instances they are used throughout the entire biblical text. So you could take a word like salvation, and you want to ask the question, where is the English word salvation used in every place in the New Testament? So if I look from, Matthew 1 to Revelation at the end, where is the word salvation used? How many times? What passages? What books? So forth. This is what a concordance will do for you. It'll tell you where a given word is used. You can also do that in Greek or Hebrew. So if you did speak Greek and you were trying to ask the question, I'm trying to remember the Greek word for salvation is I can't remember. If you knew the Greek word, then you could do the same thing. You could say, okay, where is this particular Greek word used? Because remember, we talked about this a little bit last week. It's not a one-for-one translation. What was the stat we looked at last week? The English word receive translates 19 different Greek words throughout the New Testament, right? So 19 different Greek words get translated with one English word receive. So when you're talking about a concordance, there is the notion of looking up the English words, and then there is a notion of looking up the Greek words. And obviously, the better you understand Greek and or Hebrew, the more precise you can be in what you're looking up. But don't worry about that. The Strong's Concordance is by far and away the most popular concordance. It's built into every online piece of software that's out there. The one that we're going to look at in just a few moments has it built into it as well. So that's what most people use. A lexicon we talked about. It's a dictionary of foreign languages. There are many different ones. Thayer's Greek Lexicon is one. By far the most popular one, and I don't have this in the notes, I should, is what's called BDAG, B-D-A-G, which are the initials of the four guys that contributed to it. Bowers, Dank, or I don't know, something. BDAG, BDAG. It is not a cheap book, about $150 just for that one book. But it's probably the most popular one. There's another one called Liddell and Scott, which is a popular lexicon as well. Fortunately, the software that we're going to look at again has lexicons built into it. It's not the BDAG, it's probably Thayer's. Thayer's is the one that tends to be more readily available. Bible dictionaries. These are reference books that contain definitions and other information on key words in scriptures like names, or cultural information, or animals, or people, or places, those kinds of things. And the Vine's Expository Dictionary of Old and New Testament, I have the hardback copy of that over there if you want to look through it to get a sense of what a Bible dictionary is like. And then, of course, commentaries, which is just somebody else's interpretation of a given passage. Any questions about those kinds of resources? Were there any resources that you weren't familiar with already, or were all of you already kind of familiar with the kinds of resources that we were talking about? Had anybody, I'm assuming most everybody had heard of a concordance. Bible dictionary? No. Lexicons, probably a not normal terminology. Foreign language dictionaries kind of things.
Another popular one that gives you like the cultural references.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have one back there. Those are called introductions. Not in our little list, but they typically kind of fall in the category of the dictionary / encyclopedia / introduction. And an introduction gives you like the cultural background, geographical background, the date and time of it when a book was written. It's kind of all that background information. Some of them will also include a proposed outline of the book. And they might even get into, here's what we think the primary theme of the book is. It's not a commentary in the sense that they're getting into verse by verse interpretation. It's more of an overview, that kind of thing, which is why it's called an introduction. And I have one back there. You can snap a picture of any one of those. They're all available electronically as well through Amazon, or a lot of the software we have already has, or that I'll show you already has some of this in it. Any questions about any of those resources? Lots of things at our fingertips nowadays that used to be very difficult. One, you had to buy very expensive books. Two, they were just cumbersome to use. You needed a big desk to be able to go through the 4, 5, 6 books that you wanted to have open at any given point in time. Another kind of book that's not in the list that I do have back there is a geography, an atlas, right? Just something to help you understand the physical layout of a place. So what I'm showing on the screen, and it's in your notebook, one of the pieces of software, there's 2 free pieces of software that we're going to talk about. Blue Letter Bible is the one that I've used the most. Stephen actually introduced me to the Bible Hub, which is also extremely good. Both of these, I would just suggest you kind of play around with them and see which one you prefer. But you can see here on the Blue Letter Bible, and the URL is a little bit small, but it's literally just blueletterbible.org, O-R-G, to go to it. It's completely free. There's no cost. You can see right now I'm under the study topic, and under Bible references, you can see things like encyclopedia and dictionaries. You can see introductions to the Bible, charts and outlines, timelines, maps. It has a concordance already built in. So if we look down under biblical language resources, you can see it's got an inline interlinear. We'll look at that. It has some other language tools. It has lexical resources. That's lexicon. Those are your dictionaries of foreign languages. It'll have grammars, meaning it'll not only give you a definition of the word, but it'll tell you that's a verb, that's a noun, that's a pronoun, you know, it'll give you the grammar of it. And then there's a Strong's Concordance actually built into the software. So you can basically just click on a word and it'll pop up another box that says, here's every other place that that word is used. Makes it really easy to do that kind of thing. So practically every resource that we just talked about is available online at no cost to you. A lot of people don't know that. They're not familiar with them. And even if they had heard of them, they've just never really used them. And I would, you know, at least want to take a moment at the beginning of this class to get you guys a little more familiar with what's available and encourage you to begin to utilize some of those resources more and more. Feel free to play around with some of those during the week and then bring questions back here and we can, you know, talk about them. I'm sure the class would benefit from whatever questions anybody may have on some of those things. Bible Hub, very similar, biblehub.com. In its resources, you can see the same kinds of things, right? They have a variety of Bible translations. They have a concordance. They have encyclopedias. They have a dictionary. They have Greek and Hebrew. Those are your interlinearies and or lexicons. All the same kinds of resources built in. And then kind of the Mac Daddy of them all, Logos or Logos, whichever you prefer. This is not free. There is a web-based version, or you can get installed to your machine version kind of thing. You can do it either way. But if you know, get more and more into the process, there is no better software on the planet for Bible study than Logos. It's the creme de la creme when it comes to its capabilities. You can spend, I think an entry point to it is probably $200 to $300. And if you were to buy their I Want Everything You Have package, it's probably about $15,000.
Dang.
Yeah, they have literally thousands upon thousands of books in their electronic library. For if you really wanted to have a really solid capability with all of the books practically that you would ever need, you would probably need to spend in the neighborhood of $800 to $1,200 to do it. So nothing cheap about that software, but I at least wanted you to know it exists. And
They do have sales throughout the year.
I actually called them and asked them what kind of multi, you know, if we wanted to buy as a group, what kind of pricing. And they have many different types of packages, the way you kind of bundle the different parts and pieces. And the one that would be most relevant for what we're doing here is their Academic Essentials package. It's the one that comes with some language capability, the lexicons, the interlinears, all that kind of stuff. And it is $399 list price. And then based on volume discounting, I have the little Post-it note at home. I want to say it's like 15 or 20% discount for just like 5 to 10 licenses. If you get over 10, it goes up. If you get over like 30, it goes even more, you know, kind of thing. So, you know, for in the neighborhood of what 10% would be $40 off. That would be $360. You know, in the neighborhood of $300 to $350.
Per year, or is that just like?
That's a one-time. Yeah, they do have, or at least they used to have. I'm not sure they do anymore because I couldn't find it on the site. They used to have an annual subscription. I actually am on an annual subscription. I pay like $100 a year for it. But if I want books beyond what I already have, I still have to buy more books. So the $100 a year gets you access to all the core software capability, all the tools, but not necessarily books. kind of thing. They're a bit complex in the way they price things, but we'll bounce around. I'll show you a bit of each. I'll show you, what you can do in Blue Letter Bible, which quite frankly, for what we're doing here is absolutely sufficient. You'd have to be progressing a fair amount to really need more than what something like Blue Letter or Bible Hub could do for you. And normally with something like Logos, you're going to make the initial purchase and then you're just going to gradually add to it over time. I have been a Logos user for 20 years. I literally bought one of the very first packages they had for like $50 in a box at a store that I had to install with floppy disks. So it's changed a bit. But those are kind of our options. And you'll see me primarily use Logos just because that's what I'm most familiar with, the most comfortable with. But I'm also going to try to do a fair amount in Blue Letter Bible because I have used it a little bit as well, especially in environments like this, where I try to want to show you things in what I'm then asking you to go and use. I don't want to show it to you in Logos and then tell you to go do it in Blue Letter. I'd rather show it to you in what you're going to go use.
Do you know if any of these allow for like parallel viewing?
I'm pretty sure both Blue Letter and Bible Hub do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think they'll at least put them side by side. What I'm not sure is because like in Logos, not only can you put them side by side, but it will highlight the differences between them for you. All right. One last topic before we get into our exercise. Shrink this down just a little bit. We have been doing this already, and we've been talking about this already, but I wanted to kind of bring the formal diagram into the documentation. This is the interpretive spiral or hermeneutical spiral, whichever you want to call it. This is that whole notion of read broadly, read specifically, read broadly, read specifically, right? We have the starting point and we have the presuppositions, right? Remember, the first thing you should try to do is acknowledge what your pre-existing biases or beliefs are. If you've studied Philippians in the past, or you've listened to messages, or you've heard sermons, and maybe there's only 2 or 3 passages in Philippians that you know anything about just because of what you've learned over the years, and you think you already know what that passage means, you kind of want to acknowledge that, maybe write it down, stick it all to the side, right? You start with, what do I already understand about this book or passage? Then we read the whole book, just like we did the first day here. Now, when we're talking about Philippians, no big deal. 20 minutes, you're done. You want to talk about Matthew, 28 chapters, Revelation, 21 chapters, but complex. Romans, 16 chapters, but man, is there a lot of content. Hebrews, some of these books are much harder. Matthew's probably the longest book in the New Testament at 28 chapters. And obviously that could take you a couple of hours. Maybe not quite that long, but if 4 chapters took us 20 minutes, 7 times 4, 7 times 20 is 140 minutes. So that's a little over 2 hours, depending upon your pace of reading. And some of those chapters in Matthew are like 60 verses versus 20 something in Philippians. But I'm just going to continue to say it. There is no other way to wrap your head around what is the author holistically trying to communicate than to sit down in one sitting and digest the entire book. Okay? It's really hard if you're like, well, I'm going to read 2 chapters today and 2 chapters tomorrow, right? It's going to take you 14 days to read Matthew. And you will not be able to connect 14 days later what you read 14 days earlier, right? You just won't be able to. This is why it's so important to at least once in any book that you're trying to really study, to just carve out the time, sit down, and read the whole book. It is harder when it's a longer book. Most of the New Testament you can probably consume in an hour and a half, maybe. Some of the smaller ones, half an hour. But read the whole book. And I encourage you, when you do that the first time through, because again, this is a spiral, it's a very iterative process. When you do that the first time through, don't worry too much about jotting down a whole bunch of notes and trying to just read it. Don't even hold a pen in your hand, just read it. And then when you're done reading it, just ask yourself in a sentence, what do I think he was trying to communicate? And just write down what you remember. Right? This is a highly iterative process where we're going to get a sense, then we're going to start studying a little more specifically, and then we're going to refine, and then we're going to study more specifically, and then we're going to refine. And this is just the way the process goes. And so this is the spiral, right? We read the whole book, and then we come in and we exegete a passage, right? Fancy verbiage for simply saying we study a passage. Exegete, remember, means to let the passage speak out to us. EX means out, versus eisegesis, which means in. Eisegesis is when I take my pre-existing belief and I read it into the passage. Not healthy, not helpful. We want to do exegesis. We want to let the text speak out to us. So we study a passage and then we go back and we reread the book. And then we go back into a passage. And we keep doing this multiple times to help us deepen our overall understanding of both the overall book and a particular piece of the book. Needless to say, it's best to do this with small books first to get comfortable with. You might consider Philemon, a one-chapter book of 23 or 4 verses. So why do we do this? Because of the paradox of interpretation, right? We need to understand the details of a given passage, but to do that, we have to understand how it fits in the overall context of the book. But to understand the context of the overall book, you need to understand the details within each passage, right? This is the paradox of interpretation. So, spiral to the rescue. By utilizing an iterative approach to first read broadly and then read specifically, and then continually iterate that process, we can overcome the paradox and refine our understanding of both the book and the passage with each iteration. Now, believe me, I understand that this is very counterintuitive to what we have experienced for most of our upbringing when it comes to Bible study. Because most of us have never been taught Bible study. What we've been taught is devotional reading. We've been taught to, read and then see if a particular verse speaks to me or has some significance or meaning for me in that day or moment. Or we've listened to somebody deliver a message or a sermon, which is typically about a particular passage, or nowadays, messages are more about, some type of life application in which one or more verses are used to support this life application. And we have no idea if the speaker has done their homework well to make sure that the way in which they are applying that passage genuinely fits with the message of the book and the chapter and so forth. This is a skill that sadly we have somewhat lost in the church today that we really need to try and regain. And quite frankly, it's been almost impossible to do with, up until the last, I don't know, let's call it 30, 40, 50 years, because one, the resources you needed to do it were not readily available. Two, only a select few people got the training and the education they needed to even understand the process. Because this was not the kind of stuff we got in Sunday morning Sunday school or in big service. We just didn't get this kind of stuff. But now with the tools that we have access to, there's no reason why you and me's, right, just normal folks, can't get better at doing this kind of process. Questions about any of those resources or the spiral before I take just a few minutes to show you some of the software? All right, then let me just give you a quick tour of a couple of the pieces of software before we jump into the exercise for the day. So this is Blue Letter Bible. And this, if I go to the study tab here, these are all the different resources that we were looking at earlier. But the easiest thing to do here is just to, I'm going to pick a version, and let's see. Yep. So there, you see there are two versions of the NASB. 95 is what I typically go to, but I'll go to the newer one, 2000. And we're just going to type in Philippians 1. And that'll take us into Philippians. And, so I'm looking at the New American Standard. I have all the verses here. And you can see tools out to the left here. Interlinears, different Bible translations, cross references, commentaries, dictionaries, miscellaneous, that kind of thing. I don't think in this one that I can simply highlight a word. I think I have to go, yeah. So you have to go into the tools. So once I open the tools for this particular verse, the first thing I'm on is the interlinear page. So this is the Greek. This is verse 1 in Greek. And you can see there's a forward, a reverse, a forward inline, and a reverse inline. So a forward is where you have all of the Greek, and it's just kind of in this list kind of format. Whereas a forward inline is in line. Here's my English sentence: Paul and Timothy, bondservants of Christ. And then this is the Greek word, Paulus, Kai. Can't pronounce because I haven't studied Greek enough. Christo, right? These are all the Greek words underneath here. And you can see as I mouse over them, the little box pop up, down here, right? That's the grammar. So it's a noun, genitive, singular, masculine. Greek is extremely gender dependent. This is an immensely helpful thing. I've shared this in one of my past groups before. Gender must match. Subjects, the gender of the subject's got to match the gender of the verb. And this is one way that we can really help grammatically understand how to interpret something. There's a good passage in Ephesians to highlight this. I won't take the time to show it now, but understanding simple things like you can't translate the verse that way because that's taking a feminine noun and tying it to a masculine verb, and you can't do that. That's not how they wrote. That's not the way the grammar works, right? You have to take a masculine to a masculine kind of thing, or a feminine to a feminine kind of thing. Yeah, Angie and I have been learning a little Italian because we're going to Italy in April with our daughter, and it's highly inflected, meaning it uses the masculine, the gender kind of things. The English underneath here, I think it was Don Trout asked the question last week about transliteration. So this is a transliteration. This is English spelling of the Greek letters. So, this is CHRISTOU. That is the literal English spelling. That's the spelling of the Greek word using English letters. It's a transliteration. This is your Strong's Concordance number. If you've ever used a Strong Concordance, the way they tie all these things together are with this numbering system. So this is G for Greek, 5547. I'll click it in a second, and it would take us to a list of every single place this Greek word is used. Christos is the, let's see, they're not actually showing me the thing. So this is probably the manuscript version. In other words, this is what's actually written on the manuscript. Whereas this is what's called the lemma, Lemma. It's the root word. Think of any dictionary, right? If I told you, grab a dictionary and look up the word running, you would not go look up the word running. You would look up the word run. And you would see that there are variations of run, like running. Run is the lemma, it's the root word for running. So every Greek word, just like every English word, has a root, and it has the actual use of it. In a foreign language, the root is just called a lemma, Lemma. So these are the lemmas. And you can see this is where the inflection comes in, right? Bond servants with the I, that S plural, that's what the I is on the end. Doulos is kind of the root word, and doulei is the plural version of it. That's what's actually in the manuscript, but this is kind of its root word underneath the covers. And then the noun, genitive, singular, masculine, the NGSM is your grammar. Right? Really easy to see. And, you don't have to do any hard work to get in there. Now, this isn't telling you the meaning of these words. This is kind of the grammar. Just getting there. If you wanted to understand the meaning of the word, you just click it. And by clicking on that Greek word, now we're into basically a lexicon / concordance, where it's showing us occurrences 529 times in 7 unique forms. Right? Remember, there's a lemma, there's a root, and then there are forms of it. And again, we're going to get into this a bit more when we do our actual word study. And now it's kind of showing me where all these passages are. This is the concordance version. What this is not showing me is the lexicon, the actual definition of it. I would probably need to. It opened a new tab. Back here. Let's see if we go to an actual lexicon. There's Thayer's. Okay, so the way that works, select and copy. This is actually telling us how to look one up. Ultimately, what the lexicon should say to you is, here's what this Greek word means. Reference hover. There we go. Transliteration, pronunciation, part of speech, root word, Greek inflections. There should be a meaning. Count of it, Strong's definition. So now we're getting, here we go. Thayer's Greek lexicon. Lexicons can be a little challenging to read. We'll look at them a bit more, but once you get past all of this, like here it means anointed. That's the first primary use of it, is anointed. And then these are all some of the different ways it's used and all the references for it. This is one of those, you get more used to looking at these the more you play around in them. But from a concordance standpoint, if we come back to here, this is where we can see all of the occurrences, and these are all of the verses that it occurs in. So this is basically your concordance. Everything that we were doing here is just kind of a point and click kind of process where we're going to a passage, we're clicking on the tools, we're clicking onto words. And so it's something you just want to kind of play around with and get, more comfortable with. And we'll do more of this as we get into the other studies. Bible Hub works pretty much the same way. You'll type in a passage. Oh, I didn't pick a version. American Standard. Steven, you may have to tell me. No, you can't highlight a word. How do you do a word study in here?
They're up on the top.
Okay. So you can turn on your interlineary. Yeah, do the same kind of thing. All right, concordance. Here's your Thayers. Right, a slave, a bondman, a man of servitude. This is your Thayer's lexicon. This one's actually formatted a lot easier. One is your primary definition, and then there's almost always an A, a B, a C. And we'll learn about using context to figure out, okay, you just told me there's 3 possible definitions for this word. How do I know which one of these is the right one? Context is what we'll use to answer that. And then Logos, I think is a little bit easier. You can just right mouse click on a word. And then you have all kinds of options. Here, for example, is the lemma. And if I want to do an actual word study on it, I can just choose word study. And now I can see my BDAG lexical definition is encouragement, exhortation, appeal, request, comfort, consultation. And I can actually come down to more visual things, and I can see that it's sometimes translated exhortation and sometimes translated comfort and sometimes encouragement. And I can say, what are the verses for comfort? And I can click on that. And now down here, it's telling me that these are 13 of the 29 are for comfort. And here are all those verses. It's much more user-friendly. But you can get to the same kind of content in the other ones as well. Okay. One other thing that I will introduce to you, if you are not aware of ChatGPT, ChatGPT can do some pretty amazing things. And even as it relates to Bible study, it can be immensely helpful. For example, I asked it this question earlier today. Can you identify the figures of speech used in Philippians? And in about 3 seconds, it had listed most, did not get all of them, but listed most of the figures of speech. And it did a great job. It said, hey, this is the category of metaphor. Philippians 2:15, among whom you appear as lights in the world. This is a metaphor. And here's the explanation. Paul compares believers to lights, suggesting that they shine in a dark world by living godly lives and demonstrating Christ's character. It's amazingly good. This is called ChatGPT. This is artificial intelligence. This is AI. Yep. Chat, and then the letters GPT.com. There is you can have a free account, and you're just limited to how much interaction it'll do for you. or you can have a paid account, which is like 20 bucks a month, and you can do pretty much whatever you want. So for example, the Word documents that I handed out with the lines on one side and the text on the other, you can thank ChatGPT for creating that. I literally just said, create me a Word document that has chapter 1 of Philippians on the right side and lines for note taking on the left side, add a title in 20-point font, and make sure they no more than 2 pages max. And it created that Word document, and I printed it.
You cheated.
I did. Or some might say I worked smarter, not harder. All that just to say, ChatGPT can be a valuable resource in doing things that nothing else can do right now. For example, I saw this list of metaphors and I was like, wait a minute, there's another one in Philippians 1:7 that I was pretty sure was a figure of speech. So I asked it, I said, is there a figure of speech in Philippians 1:7? And it came back and it was like, oh, yes, there is. It's a metaphor. I have you in my heart. And it gave a great explanation for it, even though that wasn't in the original list. So you could just go to like one verse and just say to it, are there any figures of speech in this? The other thing, which is a great cheat, is I said, hey, can you count the repeating words? So find all the words in the book of Philippians that repeat and sort them by the most used word down to the least used word. And, here I just basically said, using the New American Standard Bible, can you identify all the repeating words or phrases in the book of Philippians, provide a count for each, and sort them by highest to lowest? And it said, sure. I will analyze the text of Philippians for the NASB version to identify all the repeating words or phrases, count the occurrences, sort them from highest to lowest frequently. Let me process that for you. It came back and said, here's a list of common words and phrases along with their frequent counts. I've excluded very common words like and, the, of, etc., and focused on meaningful words or phrases. They're sorted from highest to lowest. There you go. The word Christ is used the most, 37 times. God, Lord, Jesus, those are individual words. And then it actually said, and here are some phrases that are used repeatedly. And then it gave me a nice little summary of what it thinks that repetition means.
So really, I guess if you, sorry.
I would say you should show like just one quick thing so that you make them see how that some works. Kind of new to everything.
Yes. So what I want to say is that we are thinking that you've been working out of.
I did ask it summarize the book of Philippians in 10 words or less. To be honest, I did not like its answer for that. What I shared with you last week was my own original thinking. It was not ChatGPT. But you could say something like,
No, but he's basically addressing it right now.
you could say something like, show me all the metaphors. I'm on the, I can't on here. My phone can. You can literally talk to it. You can do all this verbally on your phone, but not on the computer yet. Show me all the metaphors in Philippians. If I spell it right, although it would understand it even if I misspelled it. Philippians 1. And it'll probably remember that I always tell it to use the NASB, but so I ask it the question, and here we go. These are all the metaphors in chapter 1. What I found? No, there's more. And I didn't ask for all the figures of speech. I just wanted the metaphors, which is a type of figure of speech. We're going to learn about figures of speeches a little bit next week, and then the week after that, for sure, I'm going to give you a big handout with all the different types of figures of speeches, because I know we don't have all 25 some odd types of figures of speeches memorized. But this is a great handy little tool if you, because figures of speech sometimes can cause confusion for us, because we're reading along and we're like, wait a minute, is this a figure of speech of some kind, or am I supposed to take this literally? What, how am I supposed to interpret this, right? And we'll talk more about how to interpret a figure of speech, but just being able to identify a figure of speech is certainly helpful. And although there are books in my Logos library that have already identified figures of speech in the books, again, you got to buy that book, you got to have the resource to look at it and all those kinds of things. Whereas even in the free account, you could do this kind of a thing. So using this is helpful. Mhm. There, that's where I started that question. You gonna write all that down? And it does a great job of explaining them. And again, I want you to know about ChatGPT. This is literally a computer that is thinking about your question and writing. It literally, generative AI simply means that it writes a word and then it does a mathematical calculation to determine what is the most likely next word. And then it does another mathematical calculation, what is the most likely next word. And this is how it thinks its way through responding to you. And these large language models are already at the IQ of Einstein or higher. They're very, very, very intelligent. And it will only be a year or so before they are far more intelligent than we are. But use it to your advantage before it takes us out.
They had these chat engines take them, take like the medical boards.
Yeah.
It had high passing scores.
Yeah.
It's very scary.
Yeah. I saw one where they wanted it to take the biology AP exam and it scored a 59 out of 60. And literally all they do is just, upload the questions and it thinks its way through and makes an answer. Yeah. 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 But literally use it. These things are here to stay and they're only going to get better and more pervasive. So use it to your advantage. It's when it comes to sorting through data and answering these kind of questions, it's really, really good. Obviously, you always want to read it and, they can do what's called hallucinating, which just means they guess wrong, which will get better and better as things go along. But I've read through, every time I use it for this kind of stuff, I'm more and more impressed with the quality of the answer.
Do you just type that in? But how is that different than Siri?
So things like Siri and Google and so forth, if you were to go to Siri and you were to say, can you show me all the metaphors in Philippians chapter 1? It would do like what Google would do if you went to Google and did that. Google would basically, regular Google, not the Google that now has AI embedded in it, because Google has its own AI engine. It would bring you back like a list of links to documents that it thinks might contain that content. It's not actually answering the questions. It's trying to find content that might answer that question.
How does your computer know that you want it to use the AI?
I'm actually on the ChatGPT website.
You go on the website.
Mm-hmm. I have an account. I'm logged in. It actually remembers things. These are, prior conversations I've had with it. I can pick up any one of those and just restart that conversation.
And when you're speaking to it, you literally are talking to it like.
It sounds like you're talking to a person.
It literally is having And she'll like even like follow up, like he asked her something about Italy and she goes, and she answers his question and she's like, are you considering a trip there soon? I mean, it's just like talking to the person that's kind of weird.
Yeah, you know, they're about to incorporate ChatGPT, OpenAI's model, into Siri. So Siri will have these kind of capabilities in the not too distant future, probably by January.
The
They
Google,
were just talking about the iPhone 16 was supposed to be included.
It's already coming out.
It says next month.
Yeah, there's minimal AI capabilities will be available next month, but you probably won't have full blown everything they want to do incorporated until around January. But there will be some pieces of AI capabilities within Siri as early as next month.
the Google AI with the question that you just said, it didn't give you all the figures for speech, but it gave you some.
Yeah,
Talks about harvest metaphor.
yeah,
Partnership and rhetorical question. Para something. I don't know, but it gives you a few,
yeah.
but it doesn't give you a lot.
When I asked it originally for just all the different figures of speech,
It only gave me some, that's what AI said. I'm only giving you some.
right. Oh, this was another question I asked it. Can you identify the key contrast points within the book of Philippians? We're looking for points in the text that use words like but, you know, some kind of contrast or comparison. And it went through and said, sure, these are some comparisons point. For to me, to live is Christ and to die is gain. Comparing, you know, living and dying, comparing humility versus pride, comparing humility versus exaltation, human effort versus divine work. I mean, it's really good at this kind of stuff.
Link of where it extrapolated that information.
Well, it tells me the passage.
Well, I'm saying like, where did they base it on? Because at the end of the day, it's as much as data being loaded by somebody that created it. So whatever their version is, their point of view on religion, whatever skewed, that's what they're.
Well, this is where it's more complex than that, because it's the models are trained. Sorry, I didn't mean to turn this into an AI class. The models are trained in so much content and data that it's probably already consumed all of the publicly available academic books, commentaries, you name it. It's probably already in there. And I specifically give it a translation that I wanted to work with. But so far, I have not seen, matter of fact, I tried one day to specifically get it to show me a bias. I would ask it questions like on a passage that is typically translated a certain way or interpreted a certain way for a reform view. I would ask it how it would interpret that passage. And it would literally say, well, one view is like this, but another way to look at it is like this. And it was extremely balanced in presenting all of the potential views. And then, unlike you and me, it didn't come back and say, but I think it's this. You know, it just said, you know, a common interpretation would be this or this or this. Because its volume of data is, it's not like there's only one source of where it's getting that answer from. Hard for us to even track with the volume of data that these models are able to process. It's just trillions of terabytes of data seconds. I mean, it's crazy. These models require training over months and years. They're getting faster to train. Some of the original models took a year or so, and they literally trained it off anything that was publicly available on the internet, any data they could feed to it from private databases that they were given access to, you know, public digital libraries, you know, as much data as it has access to, they're feeding into them.
So the last 25 years, we can feeding data into the system, and it's now coming into fruition.
Yeah, I don't know if we've been feeding it data for quite that long, just because the construct in which it uses to do all this is probably really only within a decade or so. But we have now hit, as of 2022, when these really came out, in 2023 was when the first major models hit the public space. We've hit the tipping point where these models are now being trained, have been trained to the point where they're useful. And they're now being trained at such a rapid pace that they're coming out with new versions 2-3 times a year. Where it used to take multiple years to train one model, now it takes just a few months. And they're training models for more and more specific things. Which are different, smaller models, very, very like medical models versus legal models, kind of thing. This is what's known as a large language model, which just means it's trained on a whole bunch of stuff.
You said use it to our advantage, so my thinking is that there's no reason for us to just be in darkness about certain things anymore, like knowing.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
there's, you know, the only reason you shouldn't be able to understand every figure of speech that's in a passage is because you didn't know that there was a thing called a figure of speech to even ask.
Mm.
Right? But, you know, with tools like this at our fingertips now, which even go beyond what a Logos can do for me, in seconds, it can help me understand, you know, what are the contrast passages? What are the word counts? What are the figures of speech that are being used? And, you know, and it doesn't just give me the figure of speech. It did a great job of saying, you know, like, here's a simile. Now, it didn't actually explain what a simile is. The handout I'm going to give you will. But, you know, it gives me the verse, and then it says, Paul compares his life and ministry to a drink offering, which was part of the sacrificial system in the Old Testament. He sees his potential death as a form of sacrificial service. It's similar to, that's a simile. It does a great job of explaining why it is this kind of a thing. And just being able to identify a figure of speech and understand why it's a figure of speech and what kind of figure of speech just helps us better interpret, because then we're not accidentally trying to interpret it literally or the wrong kind of figure of speech or something of that nature. Because the reality is the biblical authors, like any author who ever has written or any person who ever speaks a language, we use figures of speech. And, you know, the worst thing we can do is try to take a figure of speech literally because we just don't know that that was a figure of speech. I'll give you a really good example. And this is an idiom, which is a kind of a figure of speech, right? An idiom is a commonly used phrase which means something different than what the phrase might say. Like we might say it's raining cats and dogs, right? That's a common idiom for it's raining really hard. You remember the Old Testament passage where Noah came off the boat, got drunk, and there's the passage indicates that I think it was Ham saw the nakedness of his father. If that is a figure of speech, it's actually an idiom that means he slept with Noah's wife. It does not mean he saw Noah naked. Yes. Yes. Which is why he was so outcast because of that. For years, I always thought, this doesn't seem like that big a deal to just accidentally walk in on your dad naked. You know, I just like, didn't seem like that big a deal. And then I realized, or I learned, it's an idiom that back then to say I saw the nakedness of my father is to say I slept with his wife. Because it's her nakedness is his kind of thing. Right? So understanding idioms and figures of speech and all can be really helpful from an interpretive standpoint. Okay. Well, let's take at least the next 15-20 minutes. Oh, well, shoot. But two more things I got to show you. Sentence diagramming. Anybody in here just naturally good at sentence diagramming? What? No, nobody in here naturally good at sentence diagramming? Me either. There are two ways to do sentence diagramming. Again, I'll have these kind of things out in the Google Drive. Tim Mackey from the Bible Project uses this form of sentence diagramming frequently. I like it because it doesn't have so many lines in it. Where he basically just kind of breaks down a passage, right? Paul, an apostle of Messiah Jesus through the will of God, to the holy ones who also grace to you from, and it's just a way to write the sentence. So each one of these diagonal lines and continuations is one actual sentence in the Greek, down to a period kind of thing. The color coding in here is just his way of then identifying common things like God the Father, Messiah, Spirit, the beloved one. All the gray stuff basically is like the Trinity or an aspect of the Trinity. The yellow stuff, blessed us, chose us, predestined us, adoption to sonship, graced us, abundant for us, made known to us, right? This is his way of highlighting repetitive concepts, which we're going to get into more next week. You don't have to be a grammar guru to try to kind of handwrite or use a word editor or something to write like this, but it's really helpful to just kind of get a sense of the flow of things and what relates to what. So that's one form of sentence diagramming. This is the easier form of sentence diagramming. And then, of course, there's the traditional form of sentence diagramming. We had to do more of this than I cared to do in my hermeneutics class. And not only did we have to sentence diagram it, but we had to label every single word with what part of speech it was. And when you're doing something like this, not too bad, but this was a little bit more challenging. This is 3 verses, but 1 English sentence. And uber complex kind of thing. Needless to say, this took hours of work to do, but incredibly helpful when it comes to understanding how things connect and what's really trying to be said here. What pronoun connects to what? How many times have you read a passage and the word he is in there like 42 times? And by the end of it, you're like, I don't know which he was. Sentence diagramming, whether it's the traditional kind or the more simplistic kind, can help identify those kind of things. The software can help with that kind of stuff. Okay. Let's take the next few minutes and at least work on whatever chapter you have not completed a summary on. So if you only did chapter 1 last week, then just go ahead and start working on chapter 2. If you did some of this at home during the week, then do a chapter you maybe have not done yet. If you've done all 4 of the chapters, then just review some and work on your 1-sentence summary for the book. Continue to try to dwindle it down to 10-ish words or so, that kind of thing. But it is 6:03, so I'm going to give you guys about 10 to 15 minutes to work on one more chapter. And then what I'd love for us to do is to just take 5 or 10 minutes at the end and share a little bit about your summary for whatever chapter you were working on. Again, community. I would love for us to share with one another. Here's the summary I wrote for chapter 2, because these things jumped out at me. These were the key themes or the key words or the repetitive thoughts that I thought I had. And I will say chapter 2 is probably easier than chapter 3. Chapter 3 is probably the most complex chapter in Philippians. So unless you've already done chapter 2, I would just go to chapter 2. So everybody knows how much time is left. I put a timer on the board.
Thanks for the pressure.
Pressure makes diamonds, all good. as few as possible for a chapter summary. 10 words is a good target length for your book summary. For a chapter summary, even less is better. But at this stage of the process, even if you're writing 2 or 3 sentences to summarize the chapter, that's a great way to start.
Deeper.
Two minutes. No pressure. You're not getting a grade. It's just a simple pass fail. You either pass it and keep going in the class or you're out. No pressure. Okay. Time is up. So let's tackle this a little differently. First, I don't know if I've ever given you the technical term for this, but you know how in some translations you see there's this little phrase that precedes a given chunk of text? The big fancy academic word for that is a pericope. That is what's known as a pericope, and it is the translation committee's summary of the text just below it. Chunk of text. It is often, we often refer to them as a unit of thought. So the writers didn't have chapter and verses. And they didn't even use paragraphs. They didn't even use periods. Their letters didn't even have spaces between them. And if you ever do look at an old manuscript, it's literally just a string of letters. And a Greek reader could read it because they understood the words and the context enough to know when a new thought was being introduced and the old thought was done or finished. And so we tend to try to look for what we call units of thought. And we use keywords and key phrases like so that, therefore, but. These are words that introduce typically new units of thought or the concluding thought of a unit of thought, things of that nature. A lot of translations kind of give you a little boost with these pericopes, these little summaries of what they perceive the unit of thought to be. So, for example, in the New American Standard Bible, they label basically verses 1 through 18 as be like Christ. So that is their summary, not of the chapter, but of the first 18 verses, which they think is a unit of thought. So if we just look at the first 18 verses for a second, we can also see most translations will help you break it into English paragraphs, which again, I'm no grammar expert, but a paragraph in English is supposed to stand on its own. It is supposed to be a unit of thought. It's supposed to have a beginning. Anybody an English teacher in here? Any English gurus in here? Just please correct me when I go astray with this stuff, because I am not a grammar specialist. I have had to get much better at it. But again, the translation committees have done their best to try and say, we think this is what we would call a paragraph in English. And in the New American Standard Bible, and you'll see that I have replicated it on your handout, they use a bold chapter or a bold verse number to mark paragraphs, right? So you can see number 1 is bold, and I actually also bolded the first word that would go after it just to make it easier to spot. So they think the first paragraph is from verse 1 down to verse 12 or through verse 11. So verses 1 through 11, they think is a paragraph, which is basically a unit of thought. And then verses 12 and 13 are a paragraph. And then 14 through 18 are a paragraph. So they think that to be like Christ consists of 3 paragraphs, each that you could summarize, right? So if you really want to keep breaking this down, you could summarize every paragraph and then use that to roll back up to a chapter summary, right? In the same way that we're summarizing 4 chapters in order to help us understand the theme and the summary of the book, right? You can do the same thing within a chapter. You can use the pericopes if the translation has it. You can use the paragraph breaks if your translation has that, because not all of them do. And these are just things that can help break things down. So if we just look at, for example, the first paragraph, we are talking about things like therefore, which in and of itself takes us back to what was above. If there is any encouragement in Christ. So just like with any English paragraph, you typically open with the point you want to make, and then you support it, and then you conclude it, kind of thing. This is how paragraphs tend to work. So he's starting to talk about this notion of this encouragement in Christ, consolation of love, there any fellowship of the Spirit, any affection and compassion. Make my joy complete by being of the same mind, maintaining the same love, united in spirit, intent in one purpose. So we have themes like unity. We have themes like comfort and encouragement already coming out. Do nothing from selfish or empty conceit, but with humility, regard one another as more important than yourself. So again, we see the theme of humility, unity. Do not merely look out for your own interest, but the interest of others. Have this attitude. What attitude? This attitude of being like Christ in selflessness. Don't be selfish, be humble in yourself, which was also in Christ Jesus. And then we get into this. We'll talk more about this later. This is called a chiastic structure, where he's going to make a point. It's like point A, point A1, point A2, and then he's going to back out of it with like B2, B1, B, and they mirror each other. And what's in the middle of that is the most important point. This is the thing he really wants to highlight. This was a common structure they use. And you'll see in verses 6 down through 12, at least, we'll read it. You'll kind of see this structure. He's starting to talk about how Jesus represented this notion of selflessness and humility. Who Jesus existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself. So he was in the form of God, equal with God, but he emptied himself, next line down, taking the form of a bondservant, being made in the likeness of men, down one more, being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself, the very thing he was saying for us to do. How did he do that? By becoming obedient to the point of death, and death on a cross. That's the center passage in this little chiastic structure. So we came 3 verses down, 6, 7, 8. And now watch 9, 10, and 11. For this reason, God highly exalted. So now we're going back up, right? We've been talking about humility, and now we're going to talk about exaltation. Right? So for this reason, God highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name which is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow, of those who are in heaven and are on earth and under the earth. And, verse 11, that every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So he's using that chiastic structure to basically say, for those who, like Christ, humble themselves, learn selflessness in this life, you become humble and selflessness in this life, like Jesus, there is an element of exaltation that will come with that, or as a result of that kind of thing. So the structure helps us to see the message that he's trying to convey. And so that gets us through the first unit of thought. The first unit of thought is be like Christ. Humble yourselves, strive for selflessness, and Jesus modeled that for us. And as a result of Jesus doing what he did, he's also receiving exaltation because of that. Next paragraph. So then, big transition words. So then, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. So what do you think, work out your salvation with fear and trembling? This is a passage that's a lot of conversation about, but let's, in the context of what we're seeing in chapter 2, what did he just ask us in the paragraphs above this? What did he ask us to do? Right, all this stuff. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regard. These are the things he's asking us to do. He's asking us to be like Christ, and that means humility, which means don't be selfish. Don't do things from empty conceit. Be of humble mind, right? These are things. So in the context, when he says, work out your salvation, what do you think he means? Say it again.
I'm not trying to find the word.
But somebody mumbled the
Producing.
words.
Producing.
Say it.
Producing.
Producing. Be like Christ, right? So this is one of those that if you have a system of theology that's driving the way you think, many systems have used this little phrase to somehow mean that in order to go to heaven when you die, you have to earn it.
Yeah, that's not what I'm saying, because the following verse says, for it is God who is at work in you, both desire and work for his good pleasure. So it's Christ in you working towards,
Right,
not good works. per se,
right.
but
So this,
Gonna produce fruit.
right,
You're allowing Christ to
You're
work.
putting into practice the changes that God has made in you.
right,
And that has nothing to do with salvation.
Right.
It's just
Yes.
in the practice.
all spot on, right? This is not about somehow trying to earn my salvation. This is Paul basically saying, you have within you already this position within Christ that enables you, like he did, to be humble, to be selfless, to live in this manner. And so what I want you to work on, Paul is saying to the Philippians, is to bring that part out. I want you to work that out so that you are becoming more and more like Christ. Be like Christ. This is a good example of how easy it is to grab something, not pay attention to its context, and use it to support a system or a presupposition when it's really very straightforward in its context. Paul is talking to them about being humble as Christ was humble. So when he says to them in that context, work out your salvation, he means work hard at being humble, because that's part of what you're now able to do as someone who is in the family of God.
So is the idiom practicing?
Yes, that will probably be applicable. So 12 goes on, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work in you, both to will, and we're going to look at that word when we do our little word study. Stephen actually said it best. That word actually means desire. So that your desire and what you do are for his pleasure. New paragraph. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, so that you will prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent, children of God, above reproach. Right? Is he telling us to prove that we are saved and going to heaven? In the context, he's simply saying, let your life of humility demonstrate to those around you that you are different. This has nothing to do with some connotation of proving that you are saved and going to heaven, or not saved and not going to heaven. Holding fast the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I will have reason to glory. Right? This whole notion of have reason to glory points to that notion of future exaltation, which we saw in that chiastic structure of, if we live now with humility, there is some notion of a benefit of that from an exaltation standpoint. It may not be in this life, but Christ is a good example in that he demonstrated the ultimate in humility, and clearly he will also receive the ultimate in exaltation. And then the last is just one big paragraph in which he's talking about two people, Timothy and Epaphroditus. And everything he says about Timothy and Epaphroditus just magically happens to align with everything he said in the first half of the chapter. They are living, breathing examples and illustrations, demonstrations of how he's saying to the Philippians, this is how you should live. Epaphroditus almost died in service, to the ministry. So he gives us a be like Christ unit of thought, and then he gives us and here are a couple of examples around that. It takes a little bit of stepping back and working through it and knowing how to use the pericopes and knowing how to use the paragraphs to kind of chunk it out to see those individual units of thought. But the more you can start to process in units of thought, the easier it'll become to start to say, okay, this is a unit. Paul is trying to say something in this chunk of text. And if I can wrap my head around that unit of thought, and then the next unit of thought, and then the next unit of thought. Now I can string these together and I can start to get a sense of the flow of the chapter. And then if I get a sense of the flow of the chapter, then I can summarize it. So my summary: let your humility demonstrate God's life. For example, Timothy and Epaphroditus. To me, that's the main thing he's trying to say. The first half is live like Christ, demonstrate a life of humility. And oh, by the way, that looks like Timothy and Epaphroditus.
That's good question myself, not to make a big sentence. So mine was like, as Jesus humbled himself through serving, do likewise for one another.
Yeah. You got the meaning spot on. It's a lot of words.
I know.
But the meaning is right. And this is where the art side comes into play. And you know, I'm no guru at it by any means, but it takes a fair amount of practice to, one, figure out how to get to the meaning, right? And this is by breaking things down into those units of thought and then stringing the units of thought together to figure out a flow. Then once you kind of get the flow, you can start to say, okay, this is what this chapter is talking about. You do that for each chapter, now you can start to string the book together, kind of thing. But what we're learning and starting to do here, we're going to do a lot more as we go through the class, where right now I would encourage everybody. Well, first, anybody else want to kind of share what you put down for things that you saw as important themes, messages? You know, what did you pull out of chapter 2? I know it's already 6:35.
God exalted Christ because Christ does things really.
So humility, certainly a big theme that so far both of you picked up on. Anybody else pick up on humility or include that phrase? Yeah. Right?
I put, we being united in spirit and humility, where Jesus is glorified, resulting in service without fault.
Yep. This the hardest part of this process is Paul used 20 something verses to say this, and we're trying to summarize it in 5 to 10. It just forces you to try to crystallize down to the things that feel absolutely most relevant, which is very difficult to do. But the good news is we're all hitting on the same theme. This is the beauty of the community process, right? If all of us are seeing that humility is important in chapter 2, well, then we can all be pretty comfortable with the notion that humility is a really big deal in chapter 2. I would encourage you to work on chapter 3 and 4. We will not continue to do this specific exercise. Next week, we will do something different. Next week, we'll start observation specifically. And next week, you'll need the little handouts more, because then we're going to start looking for specific things and specific phrases and specific words and all that kind of stuff that we're going to observe in the text, as opposed to just trying to get to a summary. So if you can get all your summaries done before next week, that'd be great. Otherwise, no worries. Feel free to snap a picture of any of the books over there if you have any interest in finding some of those online. As always, feel free to call or email me during the week if you have any questions. I will email the recap email with links to all these sites, just so you have those as well. Thank you.
Website that you're talking about.
It is chatgpt.com.
Thank you, Steve.
Next week.
Yep. See you, Stephen.
We'll catch up.
Okay,
Next week I may not be around. I'm
okay.
going to New Jersey. It's because Lou went to work today. Got a news, so that's why they come. Hopefully next week it should be.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm recording every week now, so,
So yes, yes.
Thank you.
yep. See you, Chris.